Hello guys and gals, and welcome. So today we're going to be going over, that's right, you guessed it, the Necromancer. So the Necromancer is one of the classes in the upcoming game for Diablo 4, and I plan on doing a video on every single one of these, so look forward to it. Today we're going to be going over the Necromancer, and, well, talking about what the Necromancer can do. I've got some considerable experience playing the Necromancer, as I've done quite a few different builds, and messed around with pretty much all of the abilities and had a lot of fun with it. This class is one of my favorites from Diablo 2, and although they didn't really do the class justice in Diablo 3, I really do feel like this class has seen a much better improvement in Diablo 4, as the class feels very similar to the way that the Diablo 2 Necromancer plays. In fact, you can pretty much just straight up do a summon Fishy Mancer, build your summon army, get your corpse explosion running, and have a lot of fun with it. Certainly doesn't seem to be any issues with it. Let's start off by going over the skills, and we're going to talk about the various things when it comes to the Necromancer. And first off, let's go with the basics. So we have Bone Splinters, which is meant to be sort of a companion to Bone Spear. And Bone Splinters kind of mimics Bone Teeth because it does have 3 bone splinters. Each time an enemy is hit, 1 splinter, you gain essence. So this is your builders. All of these skills are going to be builders, and they may not be your main skills. Bone Splinters has a 25% chance to fire 2 additional projectiles if you cast while you have 50 or more essence. And basically you can get some pretty interesting effects like vulnerability and hitting the same enemy at least 3 times at the same cast of Bone Splinters will give you a critical strike chance, which is pretty cool. In general, this is really just a builder though, and there are some legendaries that can actually make this a little bit stronger if you'd like to turn it into more than just a basic spender or generator ability. We also have Hemorrhage, which causes the monsters to burst, their blood to burst, and little blood orbs to come out. This is your basic starter for the blood builds, and seems to work pretty good for that purpose, generating the blood orbs. And of course, you can make it so that when you pick up a blood orb, you can deal damage to 2 additional enemies around you, gaining 2 additional essence per hit, and then you also gain life as Fortify. It's a very tanky build just in general because you get lots of health and various things from it. Hemorrhage also gains an additional 20% attack speed while healthy. Healthy means above 80% life, and since you're going to be picking up orbs all the time from it, the orbs are going to heal you, and in general you will be healthy most of the time, which means your damage will have a nice bump, which is pretty interesting. In fact, I would probably go with healthy bottom modifiers for the blood build just in general, because it's very easy to stay healthy when you have blood orbs constantly healing you. Next we have Decompose, which is rather interesting. It's basically a magical spell that just kind of causes the monster to start to decompose. And it dishes out damage, of course. It's a channeling ability, so you have to hold down the button. But it has some interesting sub-effects, like, for instance, if an enemy dies while being decomposed, you gain some more essence. You also have the ability to slow down enemies who are being decomposed. And if you happen to be a minion Necromancer, you can beef up the damage of your minions while the monster is being decomposed by 10%, which is pretty nice. So as long as you're decomposing the monster is getting beat down harder by your minions. Then we have Reap, which is actually kind of like more of a melee ability, and this one's rather interesting. And I had a lot of trouble choosing between Decompose and Reap, because Reap tends to generate more essence in large groups of monsters, like when you're fighting trash in a dungeon. And Decompose definitely seems to do a hell of a lot more essence versus bosses and things like that. It also has the ability to generate corpses, which is pretty dang interesting. And there's some pretty good legendary abilities you can get to beef Decompose up. But Reap, on the other hand, is a frontal sweep, and if you do it properly, you get an attack speed bonus if they die by Reap, and then you also get the ability to kill enemies who are below 5%, which I don't really particularly like that one. But the most important one was the Reap forms corpses under the enemy for the first enemy hit. So, like, for instance, if you attack a big group of monsters, you get basically 1 corpse every 5 seconds. And Decompose gets you, a pretty decent amount of corpses too. So for corpse generators, both of these are actually pretty decent. Obviously, anything's a corpse generator if you kill the monster. Boom, boom. Next, we have the core skills, and the core skills are there's quite a few good ones in here. First off, we have Bone Spear, which is very similar to the Bone Spear from Diablo 2. Dishes out a pretty decent amount of damage, and it's something that you're going to spam. It does physical damage in this, though, not magic damage, which is a little disappointing considering that was one of the best things about Bone Spear in Diablo 2, is that it did magical damage. You can change it so that it breaks into 3 shards when it's destroyed, dealing additional damage with each shard. And then you also have the Bone Spear makes enemies vulnerable, as well as the Paranormal Bone Spear, which increases your critical strike chance by 5%. If the Bone Spear's primary projectile critical strikes, it fires 2 additional bone shards upon being destroyed. This one is a rather interesting mainstay ability, and you definitely can build a character around it. Next, we have this really nice one here, which is Hued Flesh. Now, Hued Flesh is an ability that basically when your damage has up to a 4% chance to create a corpse at the target's location. This is a lucky hit. Doubled against bosses. So if you are a character that utilizes corpses, this is actually a really important one to take because it's going to give you extra corpses. And if you cap it out, you can definitely get some very good usefulness out of it. As you can see, a 12% chance to create corpses at the target's location. So if you do corpse explosion, or you're worried about not having enough corpses for your minions, this is an interesting one to pick up because it does actually help out a ton for corpse generation. Next is the Sever ability. Basically, you summon a specter who actually moves forward and slashes, and then comes back to you and slashes again, which is pretty cool. And basically, this is kind of like your Scythe ability. It's not really a melee ability because the specter goes forward and then comes back, so it's not really you going forward and coming back. But it does dish out a pretty decent amount of AoE damage. You can make it damage enemies along its path for 25% of its initial damage. And then every 4th cast of Sever makes enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds, or you can go with the increased damage upon for each minion you have upon cast. So this is an interesting one to go with for a minion build. So the more minions you have, the more damage your Sever is going to do. And if you aren't going with minions, then that's a different direction entirely. Blight is also a kind of an interesting one. It's basically a puddle, like a big puddle that appears on the ground and dishes out damage over time. You can beef it up to slow enemies. You can beef it up to have a 30% chance to immobilize enemies, or you can set it up so that any monsters that are, any minions that you have will dish out additional damage to anyone affected by the Blight. And as you can see, there's a lot of ways that you can definitely beef up your minions. I mean, for instance, if I was running Decompose, I was attacking a target with the Decompose, the minion buff, and then I also have Blight on the target, and my minions are getting 15% here, they're getting 10% here, and before you know it, they're getting some pretty nice damage bumps for the various skills that I'm using. I definitely did enjoy using Blight because it's a nice little just AoE dot that you can put on the ground, and used correctly, you can definitely hit a lot of targets with it. It seems to work pretty well. Blood Surge is a drawing. You draw blood from the enemies, and when you actually gain enough enemy blood, you get a Blood Nova, kind of like the return of Poison Nova, but bloodified. And it's an interesting ability. You can have it heal you for your maximum life when drawing out blood. You can have it so that each time it hits, an enemy is hit by it, you get Fortification. Or you can also go with the each time enemy is damaged, Blood Surge Nova while you're healthy. They get 1 stack of Overwhelming Blood. When you have 5 stacks, you get a guaranteed overpower for your Blood Surge, which is pretty interesting. So a lot of very interesting things that you could potentially do here. Turn it into an ability that heals you, get guaranteed overpowers, use it as a defensive cooldown. It kind of works pretty good in a multitude of ways. We also have Blood Lance, which is where you throw a Blood Lance and it can pierce multiple enemies, dishing out damage for 3 seconds. The Lance will pierce through, and it kind of just sits there for a little bit. You can beef it up so that when it pierces through enemies, it deals 15% reduced damage to each subsequent enemy after the first. This is so that you can hit multiple enemies. So the first point only gets you the 1 enemy, and then you can do up to 3 enemies with the... I believe, so is it more than 3? I can't even remember. But each enemy that it pierces after the first has a little bit reduced damage if you choose this one. Then you can also have it so that after casting Blood Lance 8 times, your next cast of Blood Lance is guaranteed to overpower. Guaranteed overpowers are freaking ridiculous, by the way. I've messed around with them, played around with them, like on the Druid, which has a guaranteed overpower every 12 seconds, and they're really strong. And then we also have the while at least 2 enemies or a boss are affected by Blood Lance, you gain 15% attack speed, which is interesting. Then we also have the maximum essence, and then the core skills deal more damage, but they also cost more essence. So a lot of the classes seem to have this one. Basically kind of forces the skills to push out more damage, but also burns more essence in the process, or more resource, let's just say. Then we go to the defensive tree, and in the defensive tree we have several defensive cooldowns. So we've got the Blood Mist ability, which basically makes you invulnerable and gives you a huge movement speed buff during its duration, which is pretty darn cool. This one has been nerfed a little bit, but basically it allows you to utilize your corpses to gain this buff. So as you're using the Blood Mist ability, the corpses underneath your body, you can actually get legendary items that will allow you to cause those corpses to explode as you travel over them with the Blood Mist. You can also have it so that casting a skill that overpowers reduces the cooldown of Blood Mist by 2 seconds. So as you can see, we had overpower abilities both up here, guaranteed overpowers, which would reduce the cooldown of the ability. And then on top of that, we also have that Blood Mist can either fortify you, or it'll drop 1 corpse every second, which is pretty cool. So you can use it as a corpse generator, which is nice. We also have the ability to add thorns to our build, which can come in handy if you're running a thorns build. We have the Skeleton Warrior Mastery here, which is the first of the minion masteries, and gives you a really nice damage bonus to the life and damage of the warriors just in general, and definitely very helpful. So if you're going to be going a minion Necromancer, if you're going to beef up minions, this is probably going to be one you're going to dump 3 points into. Bone Prison is very interesting. It definitely works very similarly to the way that the Bone Prison does in Diablo 2, although do be careful, just like in Diablo 2, you can accidentally trap your allies inside the prison, getting them killed. So be careful about when you use it. It does have some interesting buffs that allow it to gain essence when enemies are trapped inside. More enemies equals more essence, so you can use it as an essence builder. You also have Fortify for each enemy trapped inside, and then also the ability to make the enemies vulnerable. There's also some pretty nice legendary effects which can cause when it starts to degrade and it breaks. Each individual tine of the Bone Prison can actually dish out damage, which is pretty cool. And there's a lot of tines, so it works out pretty interestingly there. These 2 abilities are also very interesting and definitely worth noting. So consuming a corpse generates 3 essence. So anytime that you consume a corpse, either making a skeleton, corpse exploding, pretty much anything that has to do with consuming a corpse, you gain essence. And you can obviously beef that up to 9 essence per corpse, which is pretty darn cool. And then on top of that, we also have you deal increased damage for 6 seconds after consuming a corpse, which of course can also be brought up to a pretty high amount of 9%. And these 2 abilities right here seem like no-brainers if you're going to be dealing with corpses on a regular basis, because this one right here just simply gives you a massive amount of essence every single time you consume a corpse, and this one gives you more damage every single time you consume a corpse, which is pretty nice. Then we come to Corpse Explosion, which I don't really think is a defensive skill, even though I said most of this was defensive skills. Corpse Explosion is very similar to the one in Diablo 2. Not exactly the same, but very similar. You detonate a corpse, as I showed you in the beginning of the video, and it dishes out a pretty decent amount of damage to all enemies around. Now, there's a lot of different legendary effects that can change the way the Corpse Explosion works, and I've seen some of them, so definitely keep an eye out for those. But you can also change the way that it works with the actual skill points. So Enhanced Corpse Explosion increases the radius, which is definitely something that you would want, because the radius means you're going to hit more targets, which is definitely nice. Then you can also choose between Blighted Corpse Explosion, which turns it into a puddle on the ground and dishes out damage over time, or you can go with the Corpse Explosion deals 8% increased damage to enemies that are slowed, stunned, or vulnerable, which is definitely nice if you're going to go with things like Decrepify, which slows and makes enemies, easier to kill. So you would throw your Decrepify up and then spam your corpse explosions. And there's more than just simply ways to just spam corpse explosions. So I think as you play the Necromancer and you figure out all the different cool ways that you can modify Corpse Explosion, use Corpse Explosion with abilities like Blood Mist and all sorts of other things, you'll realize that it's not just about spamming the button. It's, it's more fun than that. We also have Death's Embrace, which gives you close enemies take 2% more damage from you and deal 3% less damage to you. So this is an interesting one that allows you to get in closer, make you tankier. Would probably be for the melee Necromancer. We've got Iron Maiden, which functions very much like the Iron Maiden does in Diablo 2. Enemies take damage as they, as they kind of like hit you the last 10 seconds. You can beef it up so that it no longer costs essence, and instead you gain essence for each enemy cursed. And then you can also set it up so that enemies, when at least 3 enemies are affected by Iron Maiden, its damage is increased by 15%. Or you can go with the Abhorrent Iron Maiden, which heals you for 5% of your maximum life when an enemy dies while afflicted by Iron Maiden. There's also this one right here, which allows you to just add increased damage to any monster that's cursed. Basically, it's amplify damage. Goes up to 9%. And as long as the monster is cursed, you gain that 9% bonus. And you're going to be using that pretty often anyway. Grabify is also a really nice one that causes the monsters to get slowed by 40% and deal 20% less damage. It's definitely one of the 1-point wonder curses, which is really nice. And of course, you could always beef it up as well, which increases the slow and the damage reduction. But it also has some nice buffs here. So enemies hit while being afflicted by Grabify have a 10% chance to be stunned for 2 seconds, which is really nice. Lucky hit, enemies hit while afflicted with the Grabify have a 15% chance to reduce your active cooldowns by 1 second, which is really cool if you want to do cooldown reduction. And then we also have the when your minions hit an enemy afflicted by Grabify below 10% life, they are instantly killed. Now, I don't necessarily like these instantly killed ones, but I guess they could come in handy if you're just, like if you got like a bunch of little weakling monsters or something, I don't know. Skeletal Mage Mastery, again, another one that you're going to be doing if you're going to run the Skeletal Mages. You get a nice little life and damage bonus there for beefing that up, and that's another like mainstay ability. Death's Reach is you deal 4% increased damage to distant enemies. So the difference between close and distant is that close enemies are melee range and distant enemies are not melee range. That's pretty much it. That is the distinction. So if you are a caster who's going to be standing back on a regular basis, this one is going to give you a nice 12% bonus if you drop 3 points into it for all monsters that are outside of melee range. Then we go down into the Corpse and Macabre skills, which is not to be confused with the... What does that one say, Corpse and Macabre skills too? They both say Corpse and Macabre skills. Is that a bug? Anyway, over here we have a lot of passives, so it's very interesting to note these. So right off the bat, you'll notice that there's a whole lot of blood passives. These are all passives that have to do with the blood skills, and there's even some minion ones in here, so the blood orbs also heal your minions for 15% of the amount, which is really interesting. So it could be an interesting way to keep your minions alive. The Reaper side, so the kind of like the darker, like shadow side, if you're doing the Reap abilities or the Sever abilities, this is all darkness buffs, allowing you to do things like stun the enemies and extra damage if the enemies are stunned, various things like that that is going to increase your movement speed while using the darkness abilities. We also have the Necrotic Carapace, which gives your minions, when a corpse is formed from your skills or your minions, fortify yourself for 2% of your base life. And then down here is all the bone passives. So these are going to be things that you're going to get if you're going to be a bone necromancer. Things like your bone skills have a 0.5 increased critical strike chance for each 10 essence you have upon cast, which of course can go up to a total of 1.5% increase per 10 essence. And then we have compound fractures, which is after critically striking 10 times with bone skills, your bone skills deal 5% increased damage for 5 seconds. Evulsion bone skills deal 6% increased critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies, and then every 100 essence you spend reduces the cooldowns of your bone skills by 0.5 seconds. So basically this tree seems to have a lot of the passives that you're going to use to beef up specific builds, which is definitely very nice. Then we also have Bone Spirit, which is a huge like nuke skill that you can't really use very often. So if you notice here, it says essence cost all remaining essence. This means that like when you cast it, it's just going to burn every point of essence that you have, and could be useful if you're in a build that doesn't really use essence very much. I've actually had a couple different builds that just kind of had massive amounts of essence thanks to the corpse generate 3 essence ability. So if you throw 3 points into this one and you're generating 9 essence per corpse, you may have a huge amount of essence to unleash, and a skill like this could be useful in that case to just like nuke all your essence out from under your feet and then build it back up again by corpse exploding. You can do things like if Bone Spirit critically strikes, the cooldown is reduced by 6 seconds. You can change it so that it has a 10% crit chance, and you can also grab the after Bone Spirit hits an enemy, you generate 30 essence over the next 4 seconds. So you can change it in some various ways. We also have Corpse Tendrils, which is a very odd one. It doesn't even consume the corpse, which is rather weird. So basically, like, if a corpse is sitting on the ground, you just use the ability on the corpse. Tendrils pop out of the corpse and dish out damage to everything nearby, which is kind of freaky. And you can beef it up a little bit so that it slows enemies down by 50% after they are, hit by it. And also we have the enemies damaged by corpse tendrils are made vulnerable for 3 seconds. And then corpse tendrils have a 30% chance to drop blood orbs. So a lot of different ways you can make it work. It also pulls the enemies in toward the corpse. So like this could be useful in combination with corpse explosion to kind of like focus the monsters next to the corpses before you start corpse exploding so that it hits more targets. Then we go down into the ultimate abilities, and the ultimate abilities I was a little disappointed in. I didn't really like all of them all that much. Blood Wave is a big giant tidal wave of blood which slows enemies down and can generate more orbs. Army of the Dead is kind of very similar to the Army of the Dead ability in Diablo 3. I wasn't really impressed with that one either. Basically a bunch of volatile undead pop out and start attacking things and exploding. And there is a interesting one here, which is Army of the Dead also raises your skeletal warriors and skeletal mages. So this could be an interesting one to refresh your army in some interesting situations where they might be all dead. You also get Golem Mastery in the Ultimates, so if you want to beef up your Golem Mastery here. The Golem, it does seem really useful in Diablo 4, and there's a variety of Golems that you can have access to. We'll go over the Book of the Dead in a minute. There's also quite a large number of passives here, like Standalone if you don't want to use minions. The Memento Mori, which is sacrificing all your minions, gets you additional bonuses to their bonuses that they give you for being sacrificed. On top of that, we also have some that beef up the actual minions themselves. So, Inspiring Leader, after you've been healthy for at least 4 seconds, your minions gain increased attack speed. Your minions deal 10% increased damage when you're close to them. So this one would be a Hellbent commander. So like if you specifically wanted to do like the melee Necromancer and stand alongside your minions, this would be an interesting one for that one. And then you also have minions cannot lose more than 70% of their maximum life from a single damage instance. So Death's Defense seems like it might be a mandatory one for Minion Mancers because it's going to protect your minions from getting one-shot, which seems to be a pretty terrible thing. Like bosses and things like that seem to have the ability to one-shot the minions pretty easily. Then we have Bone Storm, which was interesting. It goes around you and your golem, which is pretty cool. And lasts for about 10 seconds, dishing out lots of bone damage to everything around you. And you can beef it up by giving yourself damage reduction while it's active, and also increasing your critical chance while Bone Storm is active by 20%, which is pretty cool. I don't necessarily think the ability itself is pretty cool, but a 20% crit bonus while it's active is pretty neat for 10 seconds. So you dish out a pretty decent amount of damage while that's up. And then finally we have the Capstones. Now there's 4 Capstones, and they basically revolve around the Blood Tree, the Shadow part of the tree, of course, the minions specifically. So if you're going to be a Minion Mancer, this is definitely going to be the one you're going to choose. And then, of course, we also have the Bone Capstone. And it really just depends on which tree you're going to be going into more heavily, whether you want to do the minions or not, or whether you want to do like Blood, Bone, or Shadow. And quite honestly, it's really just a one-point thing. You don't want to get it, obviously, if you're not going to be using blood skills. And like you wouldn't get this one if you're not going to use minion skills and so forth and so on. So these are actually just kind of very specific to the builds that you're going to be doing. And unlike the other classes, the Necromancer has the Book of the Dead. Now, I don't have access to the Golems, unfortunately, but I did in the beta, and I got to test those around. But basically how the Book of the Dead works is you get to choose what kind of minions you want. There is the skirmishers, which are sword-wielding, like general damage-dealing creatures, and they have some nice buffs. Like for instance, you can raise one additional skirmisher, or you can have them each time they critically strike. You critically strike, your skirmisher's warrior's next attack will critically strike as well. So this is going to be interesting for a bone necromancer, because the bone necromancer seems to be all about crits. So if you're critically striking all the time, then your minions will be critically striking all the time with the skirmishers. We also have the defenders, which are pretty tanky and honestly very useful, even if you don't plan to build the necromancer minions, because you can utilize this buff, which gives them the ability to negate damage every 6 seconds. So just a complete negation of any damage that they would potentially take once every 6 seconds, which kind of prevents them from getting one shot a lot, which is actually pretty nice. And you could also increase their thorns damage if you want to as well. Now you can also sacrifice these guys, so we'll go over that at the end. Reapers are AoE spike damage. They have a really big hit that hits in front of them and does pretty nice damage, but it doesn't go off all the time. It's like a wind-up ability, and they tend to be really nice for dealing with a lot of trash mobs and dungeons and things like that. And I'm not really 100% sure like what I would use them for, but like definitely not bosses. But they seem a lot better for just running through areas and dungeons and stuff like that, because they dish out more AoE damage in general. They also have the ability to immobilize, slow, or stun monsters, which is nice. And then on top of that, you can also have them hew off flesh to create corpses, so they become corpse generators, which is pretty cool. The sacrifice abilities for the skirmishers is a crit chance increase of 5%. The sacrifice for the defenders is a 15% non-physical resistance, which is pretty nice. And then the reapers is 15% increased shadow damage. And as I talked about earlier in the tree, if you do plan to sacrifice these guys, there is a bonus which will actually give you a 20% increase per point. So 20, 40, 60, a 60% increase of their sacrifice bonuses, which is pretty cool. Then on top of that, we also have the skeletal mages. And the skeletal mages, we have the shadow mages, which dish out shadow damage, of course. And they have a 10% chance to stun, which is pretty nice. They can also fire an additional bolt every 5th attack, which is just extra damage. Their sacrifice effect is increased maximum essence by 15, which could be really useful if you're doing a build around Bone Spirit, which gets more damage depending on how much essence you fire it off at. So getting as much essence as you possibly can will definitely increase the overall damage output of Bone Spirit. Cold mages are definitely good for crowd control and stuff like that. They have chilling effects and will freeze targets eventually. And you can beef them up to give you essence as they attack, which is pretty cool. So you can use them as essence generators. Or you can also make it so that enemies who are frozen or damaged while frozen by your cold mage's primary attack are vulnerable for 4 seconds. Sacrificing them will give you a 15% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, but you can no longer raise the mages. And then finally, we have the bone mages. Now, the bone mages are a little strange, and they actually kind of like kill themselves. They dish out more damage, but they also damage themselves in the process, and they end up killing themselves, which means they take a little bit more micromanaging, and I didn't really enjoy the micromanaging aspect of the bone mages. And they have some interesting sacrifices as well, which I can't show you, unfortunately, right now. I do think I have images of these. Let me see if I can pull them up on camera here. Book of the Dead. Bone Mages. Here it is. This is the Bone Mages image. So Bone Mages reduce the life of your Bone Mage's attacks by 15%. 10% after being alive for 5 seconds. Bone Mages deal 40% increased damage. Each time the Bone Mage dies from its own attack, they leave behind a corpse and fortify you for 2,188 life. So this is the Bone Mage kind of like a corpse generator thing. And sacrifice is your overpower damage is increased by 30%, but you can no longer raise skeletal mages. This one could be interesting if you are, for instance, doing the Blood Mage, which has all the free overpowers. Then we also have the golems. So I can't show you the golems in the game, but I can show you the pictures of the golems that I have. So first off, the blood golem is drains life from nearby enemies. Your blood golem absorbs 15% of the damage you would take, which kind of helps you stay alive. While healthy, your blood golem gains 25% damage reduction for 25% increased damage. Your maximum life is increased by 10% if you sacrifice him. Then we also have the Bone Golem, which is more of a tank. So the Bone Golem has a taunt, which goes off all the time, which is pretty nice. So taunts enemies in a wide area. And each time your Bone Golem takes up to 20% of its maximum life and damage, it sheds a corpse. So you can also use the Bone Golem as a corpse generator. As you can see, a lot of these actually work as corpse generators, which is pretty good. You can also make it so that your Bone Golem gains 10% of its maximum life, and the amount of thorns they inherit from you is increased. And if you sacrifice him, you get 10% increased attack speed. And then finally is the Iron Golem. This is the last one. So slams the ground and stuns enemies. Every 5th Iron Golem attack causes a shockwave, dealing 16% damage to the primary enemy and to enemies behind them. He also has a slam, which makes enemies vulnerable. And then if you sacrifice him, you gain 30% increased critical strike damage. So pretty interesting. The Book of the Dead allows you to customize your army or sacrifice them entirely. And of course, the Necromancer himself is just a very versatile class. Obviously, you have the ability to be a caster. You have the ability to be a melee character now with the abilities like Reap and Sever. And you can even do the Blood Nova. Unfortunately, there's really no poison tree like in Diablo 2, so they kind of took that out entirely. But basically, the 4 main trees, of course you can mix and match them to your heart's content, is the Bone Tree, the Blood Tree, the Shadow Tree, and the Minion Tree. Now, of course, you can add the minions into just about any tree, and there's definitely some very interesting ways that the minions can function to help out your builds. In fact, I would strongly advise actually taking a look at some of the things that the minions can do, because things like creating corpses, additional essence creation of like the cold mages, and all sorts of stuff like that can actually be extremely useful to specific builds. Like, say you're on a very essence-heavy build, well, then the essence generator, Cold Mages, could be a very interesting choice. Or maybe you just really need lots and lots of corpses, and the more corpses you can get, the better. Well, the Bone Golem can generate corpses, the Reapers can generate corpses, you know, the Bone Mages can generate corpses, etc. And you can have just like an infinite number of corpses at your beck and call if you set it up properly. Overall, I was very impressed with the Necromancer, and although there was a bug in beta, which I will mention, that the minions were actually very weak, they did a hot fix patch, and they fixed it, and the minions are back to their old selves again, which is pretty cool. Another interesting thing that I think I need to talk about is the Skeletal Priest. Now, I don't particularly like the Skeletal Priest myself, but when you cast your Skeletal Mage ability, or your Skeletal Mage ability, and you already have a maximum number of minions, you actually cast a Skeletal Priest, which heals your minions. It's not a very good heal, and it does actually cause them to get a little bit of extra damage as well, which is nice. I don't particularly think that the Skeletal Priest is done very well, because a lot of the times it's easier just to let your minion die and resurrect him than it is to go through the process of trying to heal him, because the heal from the Skeletal Priest is just so bad that you can burn like 20 or 30 Skeletal Priests and still not heal your skeleton to max, which is pretty sad. I'd like to see them buff that heal up on the Skeletal Priest quite a bit. I think that's pretty much it for the Necromancer. I do appreciate you guys and gals watching my videos, even when it's just me talking for 30 minutes on the Necromancer. And as always, keep watching.